Good evening. My name's Nelson. I'm one of the pastors here on staff at Grace. And before I share just a few words of reflection on Good Friday with you, one brief announcement, just to add to the list that Pastor Drew shared of services that are happening in the next couple days. There is also a Saturday Easter Vigil happening tomorrow at 7 p.m. at St. Ambrose Anglican Church. So just one more opportunity, again, 7 p.m. over at St. Ambrose. Please avail yourself of that service. And that's my only announcement, I promise. Well, whether you have walked with Jesus all of your life or you're just curious about him and his claims, perhaps you've asked this question before, perhaps you're asking it even this evening as you come into this space on Good Friday. Why on earth would we focus on Good Friday when the whole story of Christianity revolves around the resurrection? Why take ourselves through such a dark part of the story when we know we could just skip a few chapters ahead and get to the light? I think it's a fair question. Because if we're honest, of course we want to bypass Good Friday to get to Easter Sunday. Of course we want to bypass death to get to resurrection. Of course we'd rather bypass a difficult conversation or conflict in order to get to resolution as quickly as possible. Engaging with suffering is, let's just say it, it's difficult. And it's unnatural for many, if not most of us. There's a quote from a woman. She's a teacher and author and philosopher. Her name is Simone Weil. And can go ahead and put that up on the screen. Here's what she says about suffering and pain. Thought revolts from contemplating affliction to the same degree that living flesh recoils from death. A stag advancing voluntarily, step by step, to offer itself to the teeth of a pack of hounds is about as probable as an act of attention directed towards a real affliction, which is close at hand on the part of a mind which is free to avoid it. In other words, the natural human response to suffering is to put it at a distance as quickly as we possibly can. And we intuitively understand that. But here's the problem. We miss out on the fullness of Easter Sunday when we bypass the reality of Good Friday. Or in everyday terms, we cheapen joy when we avoid grief in our lives. And you don't just have to take my word for it. There have been developments in the field of neuroscience, and as a disclaimer, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I do listen to podcasts, so kind of similar. But there have been developments in this field that have revealed what we now know, what we now call mirror neurons. And mirror neurons help us see that our feelings are actually mirror images of each other. So when we engage with the reality of suffering and pain and injustice in our lives, however unpleasant that might be, we actually extend our emotional range on the other side of the spectrum so that we can experience the fullness of emotions like joy and gratitude and peace. So in other words, to the extent that we avoid grief in our lives, we actually rob ourselves of joy in its fullest sense. We truncate, we shrink our emotional range. And you might say, great, fine, I'll acknowledge the importance even the necessity of engaging with grief and suffering and hardship in my life. That's fine, I'll give that to you. But I still don't know if I can do that. And I still don't know if I want to do that, you might say. And I get that. I am one who, more often than not, would rather just numb out or ignore hard, difficult things in my life. And I think rather than just trying to appeal to your will and saying you just need to work harder at engaging with grief and pain and suffering in your life, I don't think that would be wise. I would actually suggest to you this evening that we actually need help from beyond ourselves to fully engage with grief and suffering and death in this world. It is so unnatural to do so in our own being. We need to know that it will be worth it to engage with the darkness. We need to know that the dark night of the soul won't last forever. We need to know that we won't be engulfed if we engage with painful feelings in our lives. And we need to know that it won't have the final say in our story if we decide to risk and move into that. A number of years ago, my wife Nicole and I were watching a movie with our, at that time, very, very young nephews. And I don't remember what the movie was, but I do remember that 5, maybe 10 minutes into the movie, one of our nephews decided that he just could not let the movie play itself out and let the plot unfold. And so he ended up telling us exactly what was going to happen 5-10 minutes in. And that was a bummer. But something interesting happened. I noticed, at least for myself, when scenes came up in the movie where it looked like darkness might prevail over goodness, where evil might win the day, even though it was just a children's movie, I actually noticed myself more able to engage fully in those scenes of darkness and pain and suffering because I knew where the story was going. And because I knew that those scenes, while darkness might look like it would reign, I knew that in fact it wouldn't, and everything would turn out okay. So I don't necessarily recommend you engage with movies like that or use that mode, but to each their own, I suppose. But similarly, the Christian story has a huge spoiler right in the middle of it. It tells us the end of the story long before we get there. We are living in the middle of the story, somewhere in the middle, and yet we know where this is going. We know that because of Easter Sunday, one day all things will be made new, and we will dwell with God forever without sin in our lives. So I would simply submit to you this evening that knowing the goodness of the end of the story shouldn't cause us to sidestep or ignore or numb out harder parts of the story. It should actually teach us to engage more fully with grief and darkness and pain and death in our lives. Why? We know that we will not be engulfed by pain because someone was engulfed for us. We won't be consumed by the curse of the law because one became a curse for us and hung on a tree. We will not be undone because one was undone for us on Calvary. And so we are given permission, not only tonight, but in our lives. And not only permission, we are empowered to engage fully with the dark and scary and unpleasant parts of the story, including Good Friday, because we know where the story is going. So, knowing that, I'll close with this quote. And so he was raised on a cross, and a title was fixed, indicating who it was to be executed. Painful it is to say, but more terrible not to say. He who suspended the earth is suspended. He who fixed the heavens is fixed. He who fastened all things is fastened to the wood. The master is outraged. God is murdered.